Hello, everybody, and welcome to Conservatish, episode 220, I believe. My name is Peter Edgar Feliciano. Make sure you subscribe wherever you're listening. Make sure you rate this and share this and review it. And find me on Instagram at Peter_Feliciano. And on Patreon, you can support my music and my podcast at patreon.com/conservatish. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Betrus. It's Betrus or Betrus?
Betrus.
I knew it. See, that's why I get paid a lot of money to do this show. Thank you so much for joining me, Michael. Please tell everybody where they can find you and follow you and support you.
Sure. So my name is Michael Betrus, and I've written a couple of books on COVID-19. The first is Lockdowns on Trial, and the second is The Science versus the Lockdowns. And so you can find those wherever you pick up books. And then I'm also on Twitter, and my email address is on Twitter if anybody wants to reach out. I'll tell you, Peter, one thing that's been interesting is my first book came out 2 years ago this July, and it's been a fascinating experience. I've gotten letters from readers on 5 continents regarding COVID and everything, COVID and lockdowns. And it's been an incredible response. I mean, to think that you get these random letters or emails from people in Australia and people in China and all over Europe and Canada, and it's been a crazy experience.
Right. One of my favorite things about your approach to this is you are very careful to not get overly political. You said something in one of your talks that you said this is data based than it is politics based or even freedom based.
Yeah, I mean,
so you
could read either one of my books and not know whom I voted for. I mean,
right.
I only think the freedom argument holds up if the data supports it. And so rather than me get on some freedom or political rant, my real charter in this is to educate people and give them the data, and then they can kind of make up their minds, because the data is all out there. It's just a matter of from what lens do we see it, right? Do we see it through a lockdown lens where, hey, we need to do everything we can, or do we see it as a proportional risk and say some of these things just don't work, and so the things that work most effectively, we should probably do this, and the rest of it, we just need to be prudent when it rolls through our community, and otherwise, we just need to. So there's a lot of people that are carrying that torch around freedom and around politics, and so for me, I just want to provide some data and let everybody else make up their mind.
Right. And I appreciate that approach, because it is so easy. Now, even though you are coming from a database, you are still, I'm sure, have faced a number of instances of backlash, and we won't necessarily say from which side, but we all kind of know probably. But what has the backlash looked like towards you, if any?
So I've probably done a little over 400 interviews on this since my first book came out. And I've been on national news live, and this is all a new journey for me, and a number of podcasts.
Oh, you're cutting out a little bit, Michael.
Moderate shows, none that I would consider to be left-wing or liberal shows, and the rest are all, definitely on the conservative side, which is kind of a bummer, because the few shows, the shows that I've been on that have been, kind of, let's say, moderate or where I've gotten challenged, my style is pretty calm, and I'm not a real confrontational guy. I mean, I've got some steely side to me, and so I've gotten feedback. Like I was on this one show, the Jim Bohannon show on Westwood One, about a month ago, and we ended up going for an hour and a half, and we took calls from all over the country. And I had a couple people reach out to me over the weekend. That was a Friday night show, and they said, "You're the first person that Jim's had on his show where you really sort of supported the whole anti-lockdown movement or approach, as well as why the logic behind vaccine mandates and why they're really not probably the right approach, without getting so offensive." He goes, "But you overcame everybody's objective, his objective," and it was like awesome feedback to get from people that were not hard righties and just to feel like it should be freedom. I don't believe that it should be freedom at any cost necessarily. If this was like the movie Outbreak, with the risks associated with that, you can make a good argument that you do throw freedoms out the window. COVID-19 isn't like that. And we've had so many samplings from the EU and from America and other parts of the world. And we've gotten a pretty good sense of like what's really had an impact on COVID, whether it's masks and closing schools, et cetera, businesses, indoor dining, all these things. And so it's just an interesting approach there. And the backlash, I'd say, has been mellow. Twitter's been pretty aggressive. I'm not a big Twitter guy. I don't have a big following, and I don't tweet a lot.
Nor should you be. No one should be a big Twitter person. It's a horrible place.
It's very aggressive there, and I'm probably too nice for Twitter.
Probably. I okay. Towards that vein, because I didn't anticipate, so I started the show Conservatish back in 2018. My main goal was to tell other sides of the story. I was in the Bay Area at the time. I'm in Manhattan now, so I just love jumping out of the furnace and into the fire. But my experience was I wanted to humanize, tell stories and humanize each other. Even if I've had socialists on, I've had far right people on, I've had all over the place, and we find the common things and we talk about them. But over the last year, it's gotten, or a couple of years, it's gotten more and more difficult to do that because, and I'm certainly susceptible to tribalism. I don't think it's necessarily spiritually healthy to think that I'm above tribalism and I could never be swept away by propaganda. I think we all are in our bubbles and we all have an emotional reaction that's human. But when it comes to these type of things, when it comes to this, I feel the most effective tool is that data, and is especially using the data that they have. So as an example, some people were saying that the vaccine mandates, back in 1905, there was the smallpox vaccine was mandated, And I just brought this up. I was like, okay, but the smallpox disease had a death rate of 1 in 35, roughly. So, and this one is 1 in 99.6, I believe, or I'm sorry, a survival rate of 99.6. So it's like, okay, even by your own standards, this isn't the insane. I'm not saying let's not do anything, but this here in Manhattan, it was mandate, punish, socially punish, segregate, fire, coerce, donut bribes, all this stuff. You're a grandma murderer, all this stuff. And I thought the most effective tool was to use their own words, their own on New York Times. It had for months and months the death toll, and I was pointing out, okay, the spike in this case is but the death toll has been back between May of 2021 and I think well into the beginning of Omicron, the death rate was under 20 a day in a city of 8.3 million people in New York City. 10 or 20 or less a day. The day that they implemented the vaccine mandate, the day weekly death toll was 6. So I'm like, are we overreacting here, guys? This is your numbers. I didn't get this from InfoWars. I got this from New York Times.
Have you been in New York the whole time? The last few years?
Oh yes.
It's look. I've got a lot of sympathy. I even wrote this in the first book. But by the way, I started my first book 2 years ago today. 2 years ago today was when I started writing the Lockdowns on Trial book. No, what I was going to say is I had a lot of sympathy in a way for the governors early on that made what I think would be difficult decisions. I don't care what party you're on. When Governor Newsom in California locked down California first, that had to be a huge decision for him to be the first one. And Cuomo and Illinois followed, shortly after Governor Pritzker, and then it was a domino. But New York did get hit pretty hard. They never reached the excess, the overcapacity. They never reached capacity in hospitalizations. They never really needed to use the
boat. Yeah, we never used the boat that was out here. Yeah,
right, or the convention center. But let's just say, a lot of forgiveness for those decisions that were made in March and April. I believe that's okay. But by the time summer rolled around, we knew a couple things. Highly age stratified risk of COVID and underlying conditions. If you take out people that were, let's say, over 65 and just people that were overweight, you really didn't have a pandemic. I know that sounds crazy. A pandemic is a mathematical number. It's a 7.4%, I believe, of excess deaths to a novel virus. So if you take out those two slices, we really didn't have a pandemic. That doesn't minimize that. I've got a 90-year-old mom in Detroit that I've kept under wraps for 2 years. And I lost a relative in a care facility in Detroit in the first wave. So I'm not a COVID denier in any way. I've got a lot of respect if you fit into one of these boxes. But it's challenging to apply these one-size-fits-all lockdown measures, these mitigations, what we call NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions, applying those universally across the population when the risk isn't universal across the population. And that's the type of thing that's really got me triggered on this, why I did the research. And what we've done to kids in schools is just really, it's now the mountain I'm dying on.
Right. In fact, our wonderful NYC mayor has not only not lifted the mask mandates for 2 to 4, ages 2 to 4, ladies and gentlemen, but also, I mean, that's why I've been contemplating a move to Austin. Don't cry, everybody. I've been contemplating a move partially because I need to be in a vibrant musical city, and New York is kind of. Also, I could rent a home for the same price I'm paying for a studio here. But also, I don't like that he suspended the mandates. He didn't end it. He suspended it. That's what it says on the website.
First off, so I'm in Dallas, Texas, and you could join Joe Rogan, right?
Right, exactly.
The crazy thing about this is you have to sort of step aside from what the CDC says for just a second and look at like the millions. So we have about 55 million kids that are in the K through 12 group, and then probably another 20 million in the 2 to 5 range. And so when you look at those age groups and you look at like what's happening, take even California, but take Texas and Florida and the whole southern belt, right? If those mask mandates are necessary in New York City, there should be worse outcomes happening in other parts of the country, right? I mean, I don't care what anybody says, there's sort of a mountain of data there. And we don't have those outcomes. In fact, in January, first week of January, when Omicron was hitting its peak, we had something like 150,000 hospitalizations with COVID, not necessarily from, but that was our highest throughout the pandemic. So coming up on 3 months ago now. And so me and a couple guys from that are part of this Rational Ground group that have done a lot of data analysis on this, we took a look at the dozen or so states that had mask mandates in schools, okay? And then we took a look at the states that banned mask mandates, and somewhat comparable, about a dozen states in each group. And so if the mask mandates work, we should have more kids getting sick. That's just the bottom line here. In the places that have banned mask mandates than the others, right? That just seems like common sense. This isn't like, hey, we're comparing Austin to San Francisco to, these are huge, tens of millions of populations here to compare. And so in the places that had banned mask mandates, there was 4.9 pediatric hospitalizations per 100,000. In the states that had mask mandates, it was 4.2 pediatric hospitalizations per 100,000. And then when you consider inflation, which is at least 50% for pediatrics, which means these are kids that might be in the hospital for something else and they tested positive for COVID. Right. And so you're talking about a rounding error. To me, the data, if you're going to support these interventions, it should be somewhat overwhelming, right? It should be, I don't know what that number is, 2 times, 5, 10 times. It shouldn't be a rounding error. And so after 2 years of this, what we find is that the places that had the tightest restrictions, they really didn't have better COVID outcomes. The number one data point that ties to a bad COVID outcome is really obesity. It's actually more than age, because age seemed to hit across the board. But when you look at the states that have been hit the hardest, you look at Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana, for example, they're also the highest obesity states. And so when you look at the states with the lowest obesity, that includes like Vermont and Colorado and Hawaii and a number of others, they're all at the low end of this. And then you also can't find a country in the world that had less than 10% obesity as a population with, a really bad COVID outcome, meaning they hit the top 50 countries in the world in deaths per million. And so that's the problem with this, is that there's a lot of people that need that information, so that if, we could kind of evolve into the vaccines here, but I'm 55, I'm pretty fit, I mountain climb for a hobby. I got vaccinated a year ago with the J&J shot. I would be an outlier or something if I had a serious COVID illness. I would. There's nothing in my makeup that says that I'm right in the strike zone for this. But I know I could be an outlier, so I did it. But the people that would really be at risk are, people that are overweight at any age. And by doing these one size fits all and mandating that, college kids that are D1 athletes, or Novak Djokovic, the tennis player who didn't get to play in the Australian, making these types of people get vaccinated when they're really at zero measurable, COVID risk. And the vaccines do have some risks associated. That's just real. But the people that would have some protective benefit from these, they probably saw some of this data and were like, well, I'm out of moral protest, I'm not going to do that. Well, that's not a good outcome either. They might have some protective benefit from this, but by doing, again, these one size fits all measures, everybody should get vaccinated. The vaccines are completely safe. There is protective benefit from the vaccines, and they're not completely safe. Those two things can coexist, and that's okay. But, our trust in public health, it's very fractured. I believe it will recover, but it's going to be a little while.
Yeah. And I'd like to piece apart some of what you said, but right now, the thing that I think that is a fundamental problem with many different things, and I know we're on COVID right now, so I'm going to stick my best to that, but is that the people we have voted in, our employees, they're our employees, for some reason, think that they know what's best for us across the board, no matter what. That trusting the science, that they are. Didn't Fauci say he is the science at some point? Like, I understand, he was saying it flippantly. He was saying it, maybe even I'll give him the benefit of the doubt there. But I really believe there's something in there of some sort of truth, that these people who we trust to lead us, they don't trust us. They don't respect us. They literally said, we'll give you a free donut if you get vaccinated. As soon as it was starting to be bribing season, I'm like, ew, what do you, like, I'm not stupid. I can decide I'm 35 years or 34 at the time. Like, I can weigh my own health decisions. I don't need somebody else, especially somebody in the government who mismanages lots of different things, to tell me what I should do with my body. Like, bro, what are you doing?
Well, so let's say, though, play the other side of this.
Do it.
If this was like the movie Outbreak, you can make an argument that these protective measures, or if they had a sterilizing vaccine for that particular virus, you can make those arguments. In this case, the vaccines they're not sterilizing, and they've got a weakening efficacy. It wanes over time. It becomes, something next to nothing with Omicron, what we've seen in other countries, because our data collection is probably decent. Our data, what's been shared publicly, has been very poor, but it almost seems like you have negative efficacy over time in a couple of different countries, in the UK and Israel, from what we've seen. It doesn't make me an anti-vaxxer, because, again, I took it. But it does show that what's the public benefit if they're not sterilizing vaccines, meaning you can get it and you can still spread it. It kind of doesn't make any sense. But I'll tell you asked a good question of, you look at Dr. Fauci and the decisions that were made. I'll tell you, my research uncovered the reason that this is the way it is the media. So you've got, throughout COVID, we had in 2020 about 85% of all coverage on COVID was negative. So even when things were getting better, like in June of 2020, and then in late August and September, we had periods where it was really declining and things were looking good. We had studies out of other countries where kids were back in school with normal protocols and nothing was happening. 85% of the data the media coverage, it was all negative. And so you've got politicians that basically have a green light to push as hard as they want on a zero COVID environment without really being held accountable for any of the collateral damage, which is, soaring depression. I documented this, and fractured education for kids, depression with kids, kid suicides in general were flat, but kid suicides were up. And
do you know by what percentage?
I don't know. The data lags about 6 months on this, and it's not very crisp. So what we found anecdotally, and I cited a lot of this in a couple of the chapters, is in different communities, and mine was one in Dallas, we had over the top what they call ED, or emergency room visits for kids due to self-harm. So that went up markedly, and we saw that in Texas, we saw it in Jersey, we saw it in a couple other states that I cited. The other thing is that while hospital beds were never really, I would say they got at our peak period when a community got hit, certainly they got full, right? I mean, it wasn't a situation where they were overflowing, but when communities got hit, they certainly felt it. You'd be crazy not to accept that. But what was really crazy was pediatric care and mental health care beds were waitlisted for days and weeks. And so you had kids that were so depressed that they were waiting in ERs for some kind of treatment or to get into a facility or to get some kind of counseling, and they couldn't get it. So again, it's a very complex topic, but after 2 years now, it's very hard to rationalize, why New York's mayor is still masking up 2 to 5 year olds. I mean, I get his argument. Meaning I understand his point of view, which is those kids can't get vaccinated, and so they should be masked. Okay.
Is it his point of view, though?
I mean, you just wonder, where the critical thinking is, right? I mean, even Jared Polis, so he's a Democrat governor he's the governor in Colorado. Okay. And so in my book, I graded all the governors. It was subjective, and a lot of it was
your first book, not this new one.
No, the new one.
Oh, the new one you did. Okay.
In the new book, The Science versus the Lockdowns, I did a chapter called The Burden of Proof. And at the end of that, I graded the governors. And then I wrote a piece for Brownstone Institute on that. And so I graded Governor Polis originally a D. But again, a lot of that was based on how much FaceTime kids got in school. That was just I'm a parent. I think education is important. It's a really big deal to me. And on a side note, I've written a lot of books prior to COVID on career reference guides, like on resumes and cover letters and how to interview and things like that. And I help kids for free every year editing their college essays, and I do resumes for free when people reach out to me. So you can see this is kind of important to me. And so the amount of FaceTime that the kids got was important to me. Anyway, back to Polis. So in November, NPR asked Governor Polis, hey, cases are starting to rise in Colorado. Are you going to institute a mask mandate? And Polis said, well, I'm looking at New Mexico, our neighboring state, and they have a mask mandate, and they've had one forever. And their case curve is really just like ours. So if it's not working there, it doesn't seem like it's going to work here. At this point, we have vaccines. People can make their own choice. And no, I'm not going to institute a mandate. So there was a pretty reasonable point of view on this. And a guy that I felt evolved in his leadership, right? I mean, you've got DeSantis and Kristi Noem and a number of other governors that really were never for any of the mandates. But it's nice to see somebody evolve and just say, hey, look, I'm looking at some honest data, and I think we're done with this. I like that. I respect that. And so why we're not seeing that in New York City, it's hard to understand.
You said something interesting on a show you were on that was, I guess the other guy said it, but you guys were talking about it. Is this idea, okay, do the people lack critical thinking? And obviously this is a very interesting layered thing going on, because my thing, the way I beat the drum is, everybody cover your ears. It's white liberals that are the problem. Sorry. But there's different reasons why. So here's what I think. I always go, instead of going straight into they're putting chips in us and all that stuff, I go to the simplest stuff first. Fear and greed. I don't think most of the people who, especially the politicians, I don't think it's that they lack critical thinking, because they were smart enough to get their jobs. I think, especially in Manhattan, a lot of these people are still, I'm scared of COVID. They'll never detach from that. And it's not because they're not smart people. It's because they're fearful, and because they're intellectually lazy around that. And not just fearful about COVID. That's not, of course, that's part of it. But when you've told someone, because I witnessed this in San Francisco for a long time, and I watched the death of that city, and I'm watching the death of New York. What happens is, when you tell and you make it a part of the culture that you're not allowed to question certain people, you're not allowed to question our side. Otherwise, you are banished. You lose friends. You lose family. You're a science denier. You're a murderer. You're a this. You're a that. You're a racist. You're a voter. All of that stuff. That's, whether conscious or subconscious. Your fear turns that into, I'm going to be quiet, and I'm going to toe the line. So it's not that they're stupid. I think it's just that it's fear is a powerful thing.
So a couple things. One, my comment that I made, and Doug was the interviewer. He was cracking up when I made that comment, even off air. He made a comment afterwards. He goes, "I'm going to use that." It's not that the politicians like the critical thinking, but I do think a lot of people do, in terms of they're sort of following their news feed. They're not looking at this as in depth as I am.
Absolutely.
And a lot of other people. And so it's not hard to understand why there's fear, or people are still wearing masks in a downturn, and do masks work at all? But, not everybody's tribal on this. So a good example is a guy that I met through this. I met, this journey of mine. I'm kind of an everyday guy here, but this journey's been fascinating, getting on all these national shows and national live news, and interacting with, governors, and
and now you've reached the pinnacle. You've reached I'm the best out of all of them. So you're welcome. Anyway,
getting on Peter's show was really like, it was like Peter and Megyn Kelly. Like, once I reached those two, I'm there. So I got one down, but a good example. One of the people I met through this is David Zweig. And so he's a freelance writer, but writes for, you know who that is. He writes for The Atlantic and New Yorker and a couple other places. Okay. But David, I asked him if he did some good work, and I cited some of his work in my second book. And I reached out to him, and we've texted a number of times. And he said, "Look, Michael," he goes, I'm a liberal progressive living in New York City, but where I part ways with my progressive following or inclinations is on what we've done to kids." He said there's no science, and he's done some of the most groundbreaking research on this. And so here's a guy who he's a progressive, but he's an independent thinker. And there really are a lot of people like that. I really thought the 2020 election would be a referendum on the lockdowns. I wrote that, I thought that, and it didn't turn out to be the case. And, whether that, the lockdowns, I actually think that's going to fade, but I think that the economic impacts, all the issues, we don't need to go there, but there's a number of things that are really we're just not better off than we were a year and a half ago. No. And so I think that'll come back, in the November election, but there really are a lot of people that were, I think, tribal on this, and they're coming around and realize, the science, it just isn't there. And I wish more news organizations, whether, in the media, the TV, sound bites on TV are tough to do a deep analysis, but certainly in the New York Times and other places, you've got to look at the burden of proof, right? I mean, if you think these things work, any of them, go ahead and compare to places that didn't do these things and just look at the data. I mean, it's just look at CDC data. It's impossible. I challenge anybody to be able to look at the data in different states and identify, those 10 states must not have done very much because they had really bad COVID outcomes. And these 10 must have really locked down hard because they didn't have much activity. You can't find that correlation anywhere. It just doesn't exist. And I remember in the summer of 2020, there was a freelance writer for USA Today, and he was writing about how great the Czech Republic, Czechia, has done in managing COVID. And he was in Czechia, and he said, everybody here wears masks and they follow this. And the US is, they suck at doing this. And all these states like Texas and Florida, et cetera. And what happened to Czechia last year? Czechia blew up, and they ended up top 3 in the country in deaths per million for a while. a year and a half into COVID, right? So it's not like the sample size was small. Everybody gets their turn. We're seeing that in South Korea, and we're seeing that in China. We're seeing that in Shanghai right now. And we saw it in New Zealand, everywhere. And so the idea that all these things work, or really hardly any of these things work after all this time, it's like, why did I write this book? History is really remembered by the people that document it. And so I wanted to throw my work and research in the ring as just part of the documentation around it.
Right. And thank you for doing that. Because, I've been reading this. Do you know Dan Jones? He's a historian from England. Anyway, I've been getting really deep into English history and Middle Ages history. And he talks a lot about inflated figures, deflated figures of battles. And it's all, there were a couple of guys who wrote down what happened, and hopefully they were telling the truth. But now there's such a glut of opportunity. The thing is a lot of us, and this is maybe to that thing you were talking about, a lot of people are not as tribal. That's my on the ground experience as well. Absolutely. I'm here in Manhattan. I know a couple of loonies, but overall, even the loonies are kind of fed up doing the COVID thing.
The people that are on the far right or the far left, they have the loud voices. But
absolutely,
really most people, I've got friends. When we were locked down here, we came into the room that I'm in right now in my house in Dallas, and we were locked down. We had nothing to do. We played poker a couple times a week, me and a bunch of dads in my neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And there were a couple hard righties and a couple hard lefties, and nobody cares. We have other things to talk about.
Yes.
And so I think most people really are pretty sane. They might feel, single issue voters on whether it's abortion or whatever else. But generally, most people want good things for their country, and they're not crazy about it. But the people that are on either side, they have megaphones, and it's very loud.
But yeah, and just to finish that point, yes, that's absolutely my experience. But I think the difference is, as far as Manhattan, San Francisco, Berkeley, Beverly Hills, places like that, you're not, you silence yourself. You don't poke your head up. Maybe there are absolutely exceptions, and we should recognize them, absolutely. But even the people, I'm saying, in the public sphere, even when you do, Facebook puts their thumb on you, YouTube puts their thumb. I had an episode of this show removed from YouTube because we were saying the same thing that the CDC would say 3 months later, and YouTube hasn't put it back up.
You look at some of the stuff that got Alex Berenson kicked off of Twitter, who really kind of led this movement, and the week before I decided to write my book, I emailed Alex, and we emailed back and forth a few times over the course of 2020. And I complimented his work after fact checking it. And I thought it was good work. And I think that I think we're going to see a shift in Twitter. I do. I think it's going to be markedly a different environment now. And yeah, the censorship's been it's been a crazy journey. It's been very surreal.
Right.
The censorship, the schools. Go ahead.
Oh, no, absolutely. Finish your point. I'm sorry.
Just the thing that we've seen with the censorship and schools closing, and you can't really talk about it. I've had my, on Amazon, one of my books had reviews banned for 7 months. And I was telling the story the other day, and I know this because people would write me and they would say, "Hey, Michael, I really like your book." This is actually somebody from South America. And he goes, "I really like your book, and I tried to do a review, and Amazon blocked it." And I go, "Oh, well, maybe if you try again, I'll resubmit it." He tried it again, emailed me back, and he said, "No, they shot it down again." He goes, "Dude," "I love your book, but I can't lose my Amazon account." And we just had a laugh about it. But I think we'll see. I do think we're going to see a bit of a shift on this with respect to Twitter, with Elon Musk buying a big stake there. That's just been a fascinating development.
Sure. I will give a shout out, everybody. As I've said, and multiple people on my show have said, we also, even though I hope that that's also the truth, back when political correctness was happening really strongly, I remember some of my favorite comedians were complaining about it on Comedy Central, and these comedians would tell each other, "It's going to swing back, it's going to swing back," and it's only gotten worse. yes, have faith, yes, whatever, but you are the one, everybody. You need to speak up. You need to raise your hand. You need to vote the right way. You need to move if you need to. You need to do what you got to do. There are no saviors. You're it.
All right, Peter, I'm gonna interview you for a second. I'm gonna ask you.
No, I was born this bald. I can't help it.
Because you follow this stuff and you're in the media, so I'll ask you your opinion.
Am I? Okay, continue.
So, I'm not a climate change expert. Okay, I'm not.
Sure.
I've got some opinions about it, but I'm not an expert on it. I haven't studied the data, and but I'm a bit of an expert on COVID data. I could hold my own with probably anybody on a discussion around all this, and I will probably never look at an interview or an article or an analysis that says 97% of scientists or whatever agree on such and such. I will never look at that with the same credibility. I'm not a conspiracy theorist guy, but I've seen in one sampling what's happened where I really know the data at an expert level. And the question to you is, with all this data public and it being so obvious that some of this stuff doesn't work, why do you think this is the mountain that so many in the media and in politics have chosen to die on? I could see, hold on a second.
Sure.
You can take the data in the first 3 or 4 months of COVID, and let's say it was a small sample size, it was a short duration, but at this point, it's time to throw it in and say, okay, these 7 mitigations did nothing. We should do maybe these 2 things going forward. This is what we learned, and we're kind of moving on. Why do you think, with the data so public and public health trust so fractured, and that having an impact on future cards that the media or politicians want to play, why do this?
2 things. There are no consequences. There are no consequences on the long run. Yeah, okay, maybe, politically, absolutely. But there's a disconnect in between what we all want and what we all see and what we're allowed to say and what we're allowed to do. I don't know anybody in New York who liked Bill de Blasio. I don't know anybody in New York who likes Eric Adams now. But what did Eric Adams do? He said, if you're criticizing me, it's because I'm black. I have been on the ground at these rallies. I'm a half Puerto Rican. There is no larger percent. This is the most black group I've ever been a part of, is the anti-mandate people. Okay, all of them, and they're the ones in the crowd yelling, "Eric, do what you say, unmask our kids." And yet he has that get out of jail free card. I'm black, so you can't. Oh, so what that means is there's no consequence, because ultimately he or whoever else has that. Oh, it's racist. Oh, you're anti-Semitic. Oh, you're anti-science denier. And the people who gave them money to get their job will always support them anyway. It doesn't matter how black everyone is at the anti-mandate rally. It doesn't matter how. No. I'm still a hero because I paid Eric Adams his campaign, and as long as he's happy, as long as his constituents are happy, there are no consequences.
But hold off on Eric for just a second. I mean, you just look at Governor Newsom, right? I mean, look at Governor Newsom, or look at the New York Times and the Post, and CNN and MSNBC and by the way, and Fox News during the day. So it's not
Absolutely.
just, you've got kind of a couple anchors on Fox News and on Newsmax and OAN, and then the morning show. But during the day, Fox really reads down a lot like MSNBC or CNN. That's just what it is. By the way, I lean conservative, but I can tell you I watch MSNBC more than any other networks, just because I want to get a different perspective. Mm-hmm. And certainly during COVID, I was glued to MSNBC when I was writing my books. Sure. CNN was just too hard, but
I understand.
But MSNBC, they have a different point of view. But a couple of their anchors, I always look at it. Does it pass the next door neighbor test, right? And so, with some of their anchors, I always think, well, if they were next door neighbors of mine and we didn't talk politics, we'd probably have a great time. Sure. And so it's some of my barometer, but But look at Governor Newsom, right? I mean, and Governor Whitmer, who's pulled back, by the way, facing probably a tough election coming up. But there's no racial issue with Governor Newsom or with, the list is long. I mean, you look at Governor Murphy almost lost his reelection bid. Why, again, why double down when the science isn't supporting it, when the data is so in front of us? Anyway, it's just a hard thing for me to understand, because it would be different like climate change, right? I mean, because the data is really not widely available. You can't just go to a couple websites and just look at it. Underlying conditions, age stratification, deaths per capita, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. It's very complex with climate change. And so, and that's really a mountain that a lot of people are also trying to die on. Sure. And affect huge policy changes. And so, again, when you lose credibility in one area, if a guy cheats on his wife once, trust is fractured for a long time. And I sort of look at this the same way. And so I do wonder, it's very, I can't understand, again, why with the data in front of us, this is the way that this thing has gone, when you might want to hold some of those cards back for other things that has data in the back, sort of in a dark corner where you can't even find it. And you can just pontificate on it and get policy changes. With COVID, it's all out in front of us.
Right. So when I mentioned Eric Adams' race, that was an example of the fact that they have the get out of jail. Newsom is a perfect example. He's not black, but I'm saying that's a perfect example of zero consequences, because he's our guy. He's our guy. He says the right things from the podium, or at least the media says that he says the right. It doesn't matter that he was caught maskless. I think it was like April or May when everyone of 2020, when everyone was shut down, and he's in a restaurant cavorting and rubbing elbows with people with no mask, blah, blah, blah. While all of California was shut down. It doesn't matter. The disconnect is the rich elites. I'm sorry, but it is. I hate to sound like a conspiracy. There's the elites who gave Gavin Newsom his job and the money to get his job. As long as they're happy, he's good.
So it's a little, I agree with that. There's a little more to this also. So let's just, for round numbers, let's say half the governors in the country are Democrat and half are Republicans. Okay.
Sure.
What I have found in this is that in the, of the Democrat states that were on shaky ground or swing states. And so an example of that is Colorado, an example is Michigan. In those states, what we saw was a quicker repeal of COVID restrictions. In the places that had, a very comfortable Democrat constituency, the places like Washington, Oregon, California, Illinois, New York, and I could go on, but sure. Those are the places that didn't loosen up restrictions because they had no real threat of losing their electorate. And I thought that was very fascinating. And I didn't read that anywhere. I kind of just, it came to me one night when I was doing some other research on this. And it was really a Michigan thing because I'm from Michigan. And I started thinking, oh my God, like Michigan, look, all these places that are loosening up, they're the places that are in jeopardy. And the places that won't do anything, that won't move, they're in no risk. And so you can really see the impact of the election and electability, that has on some of these policies.
Right. And the other thing is, the other part of that is self-interest as well. I don't lean so much on the conspiracy, blah, 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 although I sometimes absolutely do. And some of my guests certainly do. And you're all welcome here on CONSERVATISH, but buy his book. But I lean on also self-interest because it's the easiest thing. Fear, greed, self-interest. When CNN, whatever, when everyone else at my job at CNN is all going to say the same thing and they're going to keep their jobs, but if I poke my head out, I'm going to get whacked like a whack-a-mole. I have a family to feed. I want to get more. So if this is the game that I've entered, then I'll go ahead and play that game. You're an evil, horrible person, but that's what they're doing. They're playing that game.
So I agree. I do agree with that. That's why you're not seeing an outlier reporter at CNN or MSNBC or the most sane person at the New York Times is David Leonhardt, and he's done some decent work. Some of it's I wouldn't have written all of it, but he's certainly the sanest person there. And And so I do agree with that. I'm more talking globally, right? I mean, you've got a governors, or mayors, or school superintendents that really aren't, they're not really at risk. They could make their own decision. I mean, and so an example is, you've got Texas, where I live. Governor Abbott lists all the restrictions, and then we still got some mayors that maintain social distancing in classrooms, and mask mandates in a couple ISDs even here in Dallas. And so it's kind of like, why are you doing that? Like, can't you look at the data? Like, again, if any of these things worked, it should be obvious. We can look at the places that had certain restrictions, whether it's closed schools or mask mandates or closed indoor dining, et cetera, and comparing to the places that didn't. It should be very obvious the places that had tight restrictions versus loose, if these things worked, and there's no data correlation.
Right. You okay to go a few more minutes?
I'm okay.
I would love to talk about data correlation when it comes to the vaccine. Actually, let's do masks first, because we've talked a little bit about it, and I've heard you talk a little bit about it. Can you talk about efficacy when it comes to masks, and how soon you realized whatever the efficacy, like if it's working or not, and how soon you came to that realization through your data?
Sure. So I started in writing my first book. I learned about masks, right? I don't have a medical background. I'm the first to admit that. I'm coming at this purely from a data and critical thinking perspective. And so I wondered, if masks work, why California or Los Angeles instituted their first mask mandate, I think, in April of 2020, and they got bombed in June. They got their first wave in June, and I couldn't understand why that happened. And I started looking at other places, and they got their summer waves when they had a mask mandate, including where I live, Texas. Everybody thinks Texas is wide open. We had closed businesses. The picture behind me, my son and I went climbing on a couple of those mountains in the summer of 2020. And when gyms were closed, I was panicking, like, oh my God, like, how am I going to train to be able to get up there? And so Texas even had some tight restrictions. Anyway, I started doing some research. So prior to COVID, the CDC and the WHO did pandemic influenza playbooks. And in those, they were done as recently as 2017 and 2019. And in those, they recommended at the most closed schools 3 to 4 weeks for a category 2. That's what COVID is. It's a high-end category 2 pandemic. Closed schools when the community spread sort of rolls in for 3 to 4 weeks. And self-isolating when you're sick, I mean, that does make sense. Possibly wearing a mask if you're in public and you're symptomatic, whatever. Anyway, but what they both said was that, in fact, the WHO said it best in their playbook. They said, while there's mechanistic plausibility that face masks work, there's no data that shows it. What that means is, it feels like it should work. It does. It does feel like it should work. You're wearing a mask. It's a respiratory virus. You catch it through your nose or through breathing it in. You cover that up. It feels like that should work, right? It doesn't work because with a surgical mask or a cloth mask, the pore size is 200 to 300 all the way up to 1,000 times bigger than the aerosol particle that you can catch this. If you're curious about that, if you know somebody that smokes or vapes, have them take a draw, put their mask on, and exhale. I saw a video on this and then had one of my friends try it just so I could understand the visual. And I was like, oh my God, like, I get it now. The seepage through the pores outside. I mean, it's just crazy. So when you understand that about face masks, then again, knowledge is a little bit of power and it's a little bit of confidence, right? When you know stuff like that, then you stop panicking and you start realizing face masks aren't going to do it. If I don't want to get sick from COVID, I need to stay home. That's just what I need to do. That's a real thing. The idea that you're protected if you wear a cloth or surgical face mask, now I'm understanding, that's why you can't find suppression of face masks anywhere in the world, sustained anywhere. You can't find a place where COVID never got hit associated with a mask mandate. It just doesn't exist. I wish it did. If it did, I would have written a book on why we should wear masks, but it just didn't. And again, I'm reporting on it.
Right. Is it possible that maybe I don't know why, but I've heard that Africa did not face anywhere near the statistics that the rest of the world has when it came to COVID.
Nor did the Far East. So again, COVID is tied to two things more than anything else. Like, if you take these two things away, you don't have a pandemic. You have people getting sick and dying. I mean, but you have really a bad flu if you take these two constituents out of it. Africa has a young population. They don't have a highly elderly population, and their obesity is, I think, almost every African nation that I cited, it was like 4% or something. If you have a young, lean population, COVID just didn't really impact you. And so even when you look at some of the places in the Far East that do have, you look at the Koreas, Japan, and even China, and the data out of China is kind of iffy, but hold on to Japan and South Korea. Those are good examples. You do have a somewhat older population, but very low obesity. Even Japan has a high smoking population and elderly, but low obesity. And they probably have some natural immunity acquired through coronaviruses over time. That seems to be something I've read about in more than one study in places like the Lancet. But that's why Africa probably didn't get hit. It's young and it's lean.
Can we talk about the efficacy of the vaccine? So obviously we talked a little bit about it before, and we could go off on forever about the whatever. But ultimately, this is an experience that I had. It was December. It was Omicron. I'm unvaccinated. And I got what I believe to maybe be it, but I was in New York. And the testing sites were so packed that I tried twice. I'm like, okay, because I had a trip. Otherwise I would have, I don't care. But
was this over the holidays?
This was over the holidays, and I had a trip, and I'm going to go see family. I don't want to get them sick. So you know what? Let me go try to get tested. I could not get tested. I would have had to wait. I would have had to get up at 7 a.m. in the morning to go down to the thing or wait in line for 2 hours. I'm not doing that. I canceled my trip, and I just stayed home. Suffice it to say, I had a call with some people that I know are wonderful, that love me very much, that are smart people who know that what's going on, who have told me with their mouths and their actions that they know that the government is overreacting and I can't believe this is lockdown here and blah 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 blah. But then when I told them that I think I was sick, they immediately came to the intellectual rescue of the government and said, see, don't you think you should have gotten vaccinated? I'm like, whoa. But most of the people I know who have COVID are vaccinated. And they're like, well, yeah, but it protects you. It's supposed to protect you from hospitalization. I'm like, what do you mean it's supposed to? I can't eat at a restaurant, bro. What are you talking about? It's not about protecting me. So where along the line, because they switched that narrative. They tried really hard to switch that. But I think everybody quietly, even though they were all gung-ho vaccine, but I think everybody quietly realized, this wasn't about protecting me from infection or transmission. This was about, wait, and maybe from your research, the data does explain that it does have some efficacy as far as infection and transmission in the beginning, and maybe it does protect from hospitalization and whatever. But along the line somewhere, this was about, and Joe Biden said it, Dr. Fauci said it, all these people, Dr. Walensky, is she Walensky a doctor? Anyway, all these people said on TV, live, blah, blah, this protect yourself and protect others by getting vaccinated. And it turns out, So what's your view on all of that? Maybe I've gone on a rant.
Well, we could spend another hour just talking about this topic. So where I think I net this out is that based on the data, the vaccines, you get your shot, and you are more vulnerable to get COVID in the first couple weeks after you get your second shot, or in between the two even. Then you get a rise in efficacy or a little bit of resistance. After about 90 days, it seems like that wanes. After 6+ months, it seems like it's very waned. And And it does seem like there's some protective benefit to getting those against the serious illness. All those seem to be real. The other thing is, at any time that you have this, it does seem like you can get COVID, and you can, particularly variants, and you can transmit COVID. That seems like it would nullify the value, the public benefit or value of having a vax mandate. The other thing is the vaccines have side effects. That is real. And that's coming from a guy who got vaccinated, right? I can tell you how, put this in a little perspective. My son, he's in law school now, but he was a D1 athlete in undergrad, and super fit, 4% body fat, real lean, muscular kid. And when he got COVID in 14 months ago, he texted me and said, my roommate's got COVID. And I was so worried about it. All I did was text him back and say, you're probably going to get it. All you guys will probably get it if you don't have natural immunity, you haven't already gotten it. Get tested in a day or two, and I wouldn't go out in public too much. Meaning, you don't want to get somebody else sick. I mean, I believe in those things too. If you are sick and you know it, you should stay home. So he got COVID, got recovered, never had a cold for a day or two. But when his new school required a vaccine, while I protested it a little bit, I ended up having him get the J&J. That J&J shot for his body type seemed to have fewer side effects than the mRNAs. And I pulled an all-nighter practically watching him to make sure that he didn't have a heart issue. And because I knew that based on his body type, the vaccines were likely to have a little bit more of an adverse reaction to his body than COVID. That's because I study the data, not because I'm a conspiracy theorist. And so, one of the things that I knew early on, going back to 2021, was if you're a young male, a healthy, fit young male, meaning like, let's even say, 30s down, and you're getting your first mRNA shot, you shouldn't get it within 3 weeks. You should get it more like 2 months later. I knew this from talking to doctors that were doing this stuff because the side effects. That's something that should have been communicated out. The CDC came around about maybe 8 months later and said, well, maybe you should stagger shots 1 and 2. Well, no crap. You should stagger shots 1 and 2 if you're a healthy, fit male. I mean, so there are these little nuanced things that I learned that a lot of people knew about. I'm not, again, I'm really just talking to people that are experts on this and studying data. So if I know it, that means a lot of people have access. And so again, the vaccine mandates, they don't make a lot of sense because there's not a public benefit to those. You can get it and you can spread it. There is some protective benefit to the individual. That does seem like it's a thing. But if you're not, if you're under 50 and not overweight, you would be an outlier for a serious COVID illness. To be hospitalized, you would be a fraction of a percenter. And so those are all things that need to be weighed when you make that decision. Again, I wasn't the least bit concerned when my son got COVID because I was following it. I knew his body type. I was very concerned when he got the vaccine. And I volunteered to get the vaccine myself. By the way, I got COVID over the holidays. So when you think you got COVID, I did get COVID. And that was about 7 or 8 months after I was vaccinated. So I had a bad flu for about a day or two.
Right. But again, most of the people I know, even the people during, August, September, when the mandates were starting in New York, I don't know. I know probably 3 or 4 people who were vocally pro-mandate on Facebook. The rest of them were pro-vaccine, even dehumanizing even a little bit of unvaccinated people. But they were not pro-mandate, and there is a stark difference, everybody.
Huge, because I'm pro-vaccine, but not pro-mandate.
There you go. But again, it doesn't matter what we all see and we all want. There's a disconnect between the consequences that our employees don't face. And
Peter, one other thing I want to throw out, and I'll please ask a logical. It's kind of part logical question to you, part rhetorical. But we had I think the second half of last year or the fourth quarter, something like an 80% rise, 60 to 80% rise in excess deaths for 20 to 50-year-olds. Those weren't COVID deaths, I can tell you that. And so I can't think of another explanation, and I'm just being honest, of why we have so many X factor deaths in that age group when it's not COVID. And the only thing that's different in society in 2021 versus the previous fourth quarters or years are the COVID vaccines that were somewhat mandated or encouraged. The data on that doesn't exist, hard data, and you'd have to do an autopsy, because what happens if you had a vaccine side effect, it would, unless you tightly correlated that to when somebody got vaxxed, and if they have that data, I don't know that we'll ever see it. But it is something to think about. Again, you can have two things coexist. You can believe the COVID vaccines have some protective benefit, and there's a risk if you aren't in the strike zone. I'm a firm believer that those two things can coexist, and they are real.
Right. And lastly, at first, when I heard about VAERS, the vaccine adverse events reporting system, I was like, okay, maybe there's a bunch of right-wing people going online and reporting just erroneously. But it turns out those are checked. Am I right with that?
I don't know if there's. It is self-reported. I don't know that they get audited. I'm not sure. Okay. But there are more VAERS reporting, from my understanding, for the 3 COVID vaccines than maybe every vaccine in my life combined. I do think that's anecdotally real. I haven't checked the numbers lately, but there was a time when I was pretty sure that was what some people that were studying this had told me that I trust. And again, two things can coexist, right? I mean, we usually take like 3 to 7 years to develop a vaccine. The argument around the smallpox vaccine that you made when we began this discussion an hour ago could hold some water, because the vaccines were somewhat proven, right? They took a while in terms of testing. It's okay to say, we had to rush this out. Great. That's not a bad thing to do. Rush it out. Even if we indemnify the vaccine the pharmaceutical companies, again, we're in a crisis. I get it. That's a real thing. But mandating it and not conceding the sort of risk and consequence or proportionate risk, that's when it starts to get a little bit reckless. Again, I'm a guy who studied this, and I lost an uncle 2 weeks ago, and he was 88 in Detroit, and he got the Pfizer vax, and after a second vax, he had a stroke. And then he lived on in a care facility for a year, and then we just lost him a couple weeks ago. And he was a hardcore Democrat, union guy, union teacher his whole life. And he said, I'd get the vax all over. And he had, I supported him getting the vaccine. And he said, I'd get it all over again, but I'm positive. He goes, I lost my neighbor a week after he got it. He had a stroke, and now I had a stroke. That's not just a coincidence, because COVID and the vaccines do have an impact. There's blood clotting that goes.
Oh, you cut out a little bit, Michael. I'm sorry. You said COVID and the vaccine.
So COVID and the vaccines both have blood clotting issues. They both trigger blood clots. And so those trigger, one of the big things, when overweight people, young people, have died of COVID, it's usually to a stroke. And so it's okay to concede that, the vaccines have this potential side effect. Again, my uncle, 88, got the shot and got a stroke probably from it. We'd probably do it all over again, right? I mean, there's no good outcome out of this for an 88-year-old other than staying home. If you want to live, you have to get it and recover, or get a shot, and you just don't know how this thing's going to end.
Right. And to wrap that up, we're all making that decision. We put it on one side and you said, my risk of COVID, my risk of the vaccine. When I looked at myself and I made the decision for myself, I was like, I'm a 35-year-old roughly healthy man. Like it's kind of both. And you know what? I'm gonna take my chances. And especially against 99, for my age group, it's very small. Oh, by the way, just as because I forgot to mention this, some states have reported 0 child COVID deaths. So tuck that in your bonnet.
Well, one comment on that. I live in a county in Metro Dallas, and it's populated the same as the Dakotas. Okay, so it's close to 1 million people, 800,000 or whatever, but it's close to each one of the Dakotas. We had our first COVID death in somebody under 30 2 weeks ago. It made a headline in my local newspaper, and I was like, "Oh my goodness!" Like, in 2 years, we've had one person under 30 die of COVID in a county that's as populated as, a handful of states. It was just interesting data. We locked down schools and have these, and so, God bless this thing. Kids were not effective transmitters, and they're not really susceptible to this. And whereas in a typical pandemic influenza, they would expect that kids would be both highly susceptible and the number one spreaders. With COVID, those two things did not play out, and that's a good thing for kids.
Yeah. Michael, this has been an amazing conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time with me, sir. Please tell everybody where they can get your book one more time.
Sure. It's the 2 books are Lockdowns on Trial and The Science versus the Lockdowns. You can get them on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever you get books. But also you can reach out to me, pop me an email if you have any questions. For you, Peter, or anybody listening, I'd love to talk about this or help people.
Absolutely. And what's your Twitter handle?
It is Betrus at Betrus_Michael. My son's got the same name, so he's got Michael Betrus and I've got Betrus Michael. But if you just search my name, you'll find it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. Wherever you're listening, everybody, make sure you subscribe and share, or I will find you. And have a lovely night. I'll go ahead and end the broadcast now.